Hey guys, Alex from FastFitnessTips, and it's another day in the studio, another day to entertain you, and another day talking about cycling topics. Today, we're going to talk about probably, one that's applicable to pretty much everyone. That's fatigue. I'm talking about how to measure fatigue, how it's useful for you, how does it translate into your everyday riding? Basically, questions that I get are, how many days should I have off? How many rest days should I have? How long does it take to recover? What's the difference between, let's say, overreaching and overtraining, stroke burnout? There's a lot of questions that are applicable to the topic of fatigue. Now, if you can't be bothered to watch this video, and to be honest, I don't blame you too much, I can save you around 20 minutes of your life and potentially rob myself out of about $10 of YouTube fees by saying that if you want to measure fatigue really simply, it's pretty much a gold standard just to listen to your body. What I mean by that is if you feel fatigued on a serious level, from your own training, from your own experience over months, over years, what your body feels like when you're seriously tired to the point where you're not ready to restart exercise straight away, then that's probably as good as any metric anyone's ever going to give you. Yeah, we can get quite in depth with our metrics, and we're going to do that for sure. That's what we do here. But what I'm saying is, if you want to take a shortcut, just listen to your body, guys. It's pretty much the gold standard, and it probably will always be until something really clever comes along. Because think about it. What tool or metric is going to tell you more than how you feel? No tool is going to tell you that subjective quality. It's going to measure something, sure, in your body, which is going to have a score or value, but is that adding additional value to what you feel? That's the question. By the way, it's the same story, isn't it, with RPE or perceived exertion. The studies show that RPE is actually an uncanny method of measuring your workout effort. So sometimes in life, guys, the simple ways are genuinely the best. But for those of you who are staying with me, let's go in a bit more detail to talk about fatigue, how it can be measured and such like. And why don't we start off with a definition? I'm going to keep it really simple. I'm going to say that my definition of fatigue is the definition I'd use in the commonly used sense understood by the vast majority of the population. And I'm going to say it's the sensation of physical, but also, psychological tiredness when you're attempting to do work. Usually work on the bicycle, meaning producing power, but we'll work on the run, sure, that it works equally well. Which essentially means that short-term fatigue after an exercise, after an event, is pretty much normal, as you know. What I'm not defining fatigue as is just the ability to carry out that work. I would call that, fatigue in terms of work done. That doesn't make 100% sense to me, but I would just call that reduction in power, or in everyday terms, weakness, wouldn't you? Because if you look at that old definition of FTP, my definition, the sensation of physical or psychological tiredness when attempting to do work, makes the definition of FTP look a little bit, very odd. Remember, Coggan et al. Said it was the highest power that a rider can maintain in a quasi-steady state for approximately 1 hour without fatigue. Well, I've never known any rider, anytime, do an FTP test without fatigue. But does he mean fatigue is just weakness? As in, it's a decline in performance? I don't like that definition at all. But hey, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now, because you can argue endlessly about FTP. And if you want to have an argument online, there's no better topic to choose, because a number of people believe they know FTP better than anyone else in the known universe. So I'm not going to talk about FTP today. We're talking about fatigue. Let's not get sidetracked. Now, fatigue can be a temporary state, like a state phenomenon, one that you get after a hard workout. Or it could be the build-up over multiple workouts, over weeks or months, and that would be like a trait-related workout. And that's important to understand, because you will recognize that fatigue is closely associated with fitness and freshness. You actually go into a fatigue state intentionally so that your body then builds from the rest phase, has super compensation, and then comes back stronger. So avoiding fatigue is not our goal here. What we're trying to do is avoid excessive fatigue when it gets out of control and inhibits our longer term gains, right? So if I was to say to you what's the opposite of fatigue, then what would you say? Perhaps it's your capability or your, fitness. So fitness is essentially the capacity to do the desired amount of work that you want to do without excessive, i.e. higher than normal for you levels of fatigue. Fitness itself is going to build pretty slowly and it's going to decline relatively slowly when you stop. But actually we know it does decline faster than you would like. I'm no denying that. Yeah, deconditioning is a horrible phenomenon. We've all been there, guys. Now we could consider fitness short term like today's fitness, but it makes more sense because it's a slow gradual phenomenon to consider it over a longer period, say 6 or 7 days, or maybe even cumulatively over 6 or 7 weeks. That will be 42 days. Look, these periods are totally arbitrary, but they are the periods that Training Peaks came out with, years ago. And it's hard to get away from that. But these are not etched in stone. And so if you think that the metrics that we're going to talk about next are somehow like physiologically built into a 1 week and 6 week calendar at the cellular level, then that's just not correct, guys. But they are a handy takeaway that we can use to plan our rides for the future, right? So in terms of Training Peaks, it's no secret that they talk about fatigue in terms of ATL, i.e. your 7-day average score of your training load, which they use as TSS. And they generally talk about fitness in terms of that 6-week window, which is your chronic training load, or CTL, your weighted average, if you like, of your training load over 6 weeks or 42 days. And the difference between the two is simply your form, your balance of yesterday's fitness minus yesterday's fatigue. But in everyday terms, what I would say is your form, aka your freshness, to define it, is how well your performance is likely to be matched to your capability, in brackets fitness. Now, why is this important? Well, it's because generally when we're talking about your capability to do a ride, we're talking about how well you're likely to perform. So how well you're likely to perform is how well your performance is likely to be matched to your capability, or how well it's matched to your fitness. So your form, i.e. your TSB, is going to be an indicator how well you're likely to perform. It's not etched in stone and it's highly personal. So take all of these kind of, guidelines and advice regarding specific metrics and specific numbers with a pinch of salt. It's actually better that you learn your own levels, your own kind of zones for TSB, for example, and then you will be better prepared for your next ride. Okay, that seems to make sense, but have you spotted a problem, guys? Have you spotted an intentional problem created by just talking about these metrics, fitness, freshness, and form? The problem is we're just talking about loads, aren't we? We're all talking about metrics here that revolve around training loads, which is basically some way of classifying your ride based on duration and intensity, meaning how hard you went. So just to remind you guys, intensity factor, IF, is just simply your normalized power over your FTP power, or how hard it was relative to your FTP for that particular ride. So when we're talking about all these metrics, we are kind of talking in somewhat of a circularity in terms of just training loads. And do you consider that just the load on your body is going to be a one-to-one relationship with fatigue? No, that's a pretty crude measure. I mean, it's useful because we can track, and a lot of people are using power meters, and we can track serially what we've done and plan for the future. I admit that is useful. But if we're considering like how is your body responding, then just saying what load did you do is not necessarily the primary mover. If you think about it, the second big factor is how your body responds in terms of its internal function. Actually, we've got a tool, a very brilliant tool, one that's been forgotten actually by a lot of people, and we should bring it back. What am I talking about? Heart rate monitor, guys. Have you forgotten about your heart rate monitor? We should be using the heart rate monitor, in my opinion, a lot more. And don't get away from the heart rate monitor just because you bought a power meter. They're measuring two entirely different things. Okay, so have a look at this figure with me and tell me if you follow it. Basically, what I would say is to make this area understandable, I'm going to break how you perform down into 3 major areas. Well, 4 actually. One is the input your body is doing, like how much effort are you putting in? And that is very closely akin to the heart rate. Second is the output, or what you're literally producing, and that is best measured by your power, not necessarily your delivery, i.e. your speed, what you actually achieve, because that is determined a lot by those environmental factors. So your speed up a hill is not the same as down a hill in, let's say, tailwind conditions. So you've got input, output, and delivery, but you've also got how much you are driven, like your motivational or psychological components from that. Does that make sense? Okay, fine, but then how does the heart rate that I said is important relate to fatigue? Well, just as before, there are state and there are trait effects regarding heart rate. Generally, if you feel fitter and less fatigued, then broadly, as you probably know, you'll have a lower resting heart rate. You'll generally have, although it's not a massive effect, a higher peak heart rate, especially in response to exercise, especially if you're younger, when the peak heart rate tends to be more variable. Obviously, with age, it tends to decline. You will also have, by definition of those two thresholds, you will have a higher heart rate reserve, and not to be forgotten, you have a higher heart rate recovery when you stop exercise. Actually, that's a very nice metric, but hard to pin down. These are all pretty strong markers of fitness, but because they take quite a long time to train and influence, they're actually long-term markers. How would you measure short-term training load, i.e. effort, from heart rate? Well, no secret there, you just literally measure your overall average heart rate, but there are some problems with that, which is cardiac lag and cardiac drift. Both of those, by the way, are entirely physiological. Like there's a whole mountain of discussion about, what's the explanation for cardiac drift? What's the explanation for heart rate lag? It's entirely physiological, because think about not having those systems. Would you want your heart to be responding instantaneously within 1 millisecond to every slight stress to the nth degree? No, you don't want to be built like an antelope and jumping from one stress to the next. Your body has to, gradually adjust to any stress, to evaluate the stress and then kind of predict how much effort is required. That's why you get heart rate lag, because your body is preparing for the effort and then building up to it gradually and producing just the amount of energy and effort that is needed. And sure, when that demand stays high, obviously it's going to be very hard to maintain, actually impossible to maintain the power, and your effort level has to go up and up to maintain that same output. And that is basically the explanation for cardiac drift. It's physiologically impossible to stay like a machine at the same output for the same input. If you did that, your body wouldn't be using any of its endogenous resources. So cardiac drift is just the phenomenon where your body is using the stored resources to produce the output required, but those resources, multitudinous, are actually running low. Okay, so the reason I'm telling you all this, guys, is so that we can quantify fatigue in a better way than we're doing with just training load. Now, if you guys are happy with the training load model, that's fine, but I need to refine that too. But I would say, look at this figure, which will actually help you understand training load a little bit more. You've got your cumulative load in terms of TSS. We've already established that. But then you've got your bodily effort in terms of heart rate. And the two together, that would be like TSS over heart rate, would give you some kind of metric of stress that your body's under. Similarly for power, you've got your power output, but you've got your heart rate input. So if your power output is high, but your heart rate is relatively, let's say, conservative, i.e. modest, then your body is running very efficiently. And that's one of my favorite metrics. It's built into Training Peaks, it's built into Zwift Power, and it's built into Intervals ICU now. And that is watts over heart rate. If you look at the watts over heart rate score for each of your rides where you're trying, you think you're trying, you're equally hard, your motivation is good, then that is your efficiency score, effectively, of your body. And that's one of the best markers of state fitness or state fatigue that there is. That's my go-to metric, I'll be honest with you. Think about it like this. If your heart rate is high but your power is low, then you're either fatigued or unfit. If your heart rate is high for a given effort and your power is high, then you're probably fit and trying hard. And if your heart rate is low and your power is low, then you're either not trying hard or there's a problem. We'll come on to that. But basically, you're either overreaching, i.e., this is a temporary phenomenon, or you're overtrained and, you cannot get your heart rate into the zone that you want to go because you've depleted your body for such a long time. There is another option, which is that you're bonking in an event, or you're in an ultra event when low heart rate in the latter stages of an ultra event is actually pretty normal, guys. All right, so if I'm going on and on about heart rate and why it's so useful, why don't we use it like routinely to measure training load? Well, one of the reasons is actually only the minority of people are using the heart rate strap or even wrist-based heart rate monitor, which is not quite as good as the heart rate strap. But there is another reason which it gets a little bit complicated to measure load because of those cardiac lag and cardiac drift effects. Now, David Tinker at Intervals ITU has done some really nice mathematical modeling on taking out those factors from your metric of effort based on heart rate so that perhaps he can actually measure your training load or training stress based on heart rate. And you'll know, I've been fiddling with that figure of the suffer score for years, and I always quite like looking at that. So it's not a bad metric. The problem is basically to get it into a gold standard, we could use percentage of heart rate max on the effort, but it's actually better to do percentage in each heart rate zone, which is obviously tricky, but it can be modeled mathematically. And if you really want to look at that, it's called the TRIMP model, and in particular the heart rate TRIMP model. So we can look at the heart rate TRIMP model for time in heart rate zones. And actually, a quick aside here, you will find, if you look into that model really quickly, you'll find a mismatch between training load judged by heart rate and training load based on power output. The two are not as highly correlated as we assume. And actually, having done quite a bit of work on this mathematically, I can tell you that it's the training load metrics that are actually slightly wrong. By wrong, I mean misscaled. What I mean is the weighting is incorrect for TSS. Now, I don't want to bore you with this because it'll just create a massive argument as well. But I'll tell you the take home is that TSS is actually unduly weighted for duration and inadequately rated for intensity, which means a much bigger problem than it initially seems, because anything involving the interpretation of TSS is going to be slightly out by quite a big factor. I'm not talking about like 10 to 20%. I'm talking about like a factor out in relation to their scaling. So that also means that CTL, ATL, and TSB may be slightly misscaled as well. All right, I can see myself going down a massive rabbit hole here, and I can see fans of TSS getting really worried. I will say is not so far out that we have to check out TSS right now. But I will say that we will have to do some work on training load metrics so that we can rescale TSS to be much more accurately reflecting the kind of heart rate TRIMP model in the future. And by the way, I'm not the only one saying this. Others have said it too. Even if you just do an analysis where you look at your power curve and then map it over your TSS, we would find the same problem, because we're basically talking about the same thing here. There's a problem regarding scaling. All right, I've done a lot of talking already, but I realize I haven't really answered anyone's specific questions, and I do get regular questions on training load, rest, and recovery. So I'm going to try and address these now in the next few minutes. So the first question is, what is the optimal training load to do? Well, the everyday answer to this is the optimal training load is one where you progress at a good rate, yeah, but you don't risk burnout or injury. So progressing too fast is a problem. Progressing too slow means that you are not exploiting your ability to improve enough, and you basically won't peak when you want to peak. Now, the good thing is all the training programs will work this out for you, so you don't actually need to do a lot of like mathematical paperwork yourself. And you can do it in terms of, if you want to, TSB. So CTL minus ATL is TSB. So then, having got your TSB, what you want to do is try and put it into a correct training zone. So just very, very simply, if your CTL and ATL are in sync for a long time, then your TSB will be 0. So you'll just be basically doing the same thing again and again. Now, that's a maintenance philosophy, isn't there? There's nothing wrong with that. But if you do more work recently over the last week compared to the last 6 weeks, ATL will be higher. It will push your TSB into the negative zone. That's where you want to be for training. So your TSB wants to be negative, let's say -5, -10, -20. It depends on where you're coming from as an athlete to what your actual score should be. But for sure, if you're going like below -30, you're putting a heavy strain on your body relative to your ability. And you probably will want to think about resting in that situation. I'm talking about resting for a short period of time. So another way to say all that is if you work backwards from TSB to ATL, then through to CTL, then you will then come to the idea of a CTL change or ramp rate, CTL ramp rate. And this is where we will help you because we've got a calculator, it's shown here, which will work out really simply your CTL ramp rate based on your ability, hours you have to ride, and your targets. Let's say you want to be in base period, you want build period, you want to be in the peak period, and it will take a scaling based on your ability because not everyone's CTL ramp rate is the same. If you look at our calculator, it differs depending on your ability. So that's why we've built a really simple calculator to take care of that for you. Okay, the next question is, when should I take a day off? And the answer is, well, basically when you feel you need a break. Again, going back to my listen to your body is the gold standard. That's actually a really good way to do it. But actually, you could do it from TSB. And like I said, if it's too negative, then let's say below what you think is normal, going into like red zone, if you're looking at intervals ICU, then it will tell you, you're in a danger period here. You're risking overtraining, let's say. Interesting aside, the number of days off is actually correlated pretty well with the rider's experience, and we've built that into one of our calculators now. Yeah, it was the TPP calculator, the periodization planner. It will actually tell you, just as a rule of thumb, roughly how many days off per month you should be taking for your level. Because a beginner is going to be probably riding just a few days a week. A pro athlete might be riding twice a day, let's say. So days off obviously is correlated with experience, needless to say. Now, looking at the bigger picture, it's not just days off you need to consider, you also need to consider weeks off, isn't it? Because you can't just go hard week forever. And when we were building our Training Peaks programs, basically our workouts, we have tried to put in at least one easier week in longer programs. Now, we are not too worried about that because we discuss the concept of fatigue during the plan when we try and work with an athlete to find the plan that they would most benefit from. But generally a rule of thumb is a lot of people work on like a 3 weeks on, then 1 week easier, 3 weeks on, 1 week easier. But that cycle is very individual. Like when I look at my ability, if I stop riding for a day or 2 days, my ability falls off a cliff and I find it really hard to claw it back. So for me, rest days are actually not the best thing to string together. Rest weeks are also kind of a no-no, like if they're too low in terms of effort. This introduces a whole topic, doesn't it, of tapering. I'm not going to get into that now. This video is long enough as it is, but we'll do that video in the future. Okay, next I'm going to answer the question, how long should I rest for? Well, you could use an advanced metric like the new wave of apps looking at heart rate variability. I'm reviewing 3 apps right now and I'll produce something about that in the new year. But I will say keep resting until basically you feel fresh and motivated, not over fresh and over rested because that's too far. As a rule of thumb, if you can ride without DOMs and achieve your maximum heart rate and also your resting heart rate is pretty much near normal before you start, then you've done enough resting. You can exercise then. This is the time. In my experience, you can often rest too long and lose your gains. And we're introducing there a topic of tapering, aren't we? I'm not going to talk about that now. We'll talk about that sometime in the future for a dedicated video just on its own. And lastly, let's address the topic of what are the signs of over-exercising, overreaching, or overtraining. Well, just as a rule of thumb, they are persistently low powered despite trying, persistently high heart rate when you're trying to produce a power, but you're producing a little but trying hard, i.e. very low efficiency. But there's the reverse of that, which also is probably a more red flag, if you like, for a longer term problem, in that you just cannot get your heart rate into the zone you need. You cannot achieve your maximum heart rate. You cannot get your heart rate up, as it were. No puns intended there. There's also loss of general motivation because the psychological factor is very much affected by your performance. The two are inextricably linked. And yeah, just generally feeling drained, even obviously when training, but it can spill over to feeling drained when initially resting. That is a real red flag. And so what do you do about it, guys? Well, there's no massive secret here, but generally you got to rest some more initially, rest another day, at least one more day to see whether your body is still in the improving phase. You know, a lot of gains are made from that rest period. Gains are basically made in the overload and then rest combination. So resting is important. Do something different, I would say. For example, if you're just riding the TT bike, try to go on a social ride. If you're sick of riding the bike outdoors, ride indoors. If you're sick of your regular bike, ride a spin bike for a while. If you can't face riding, do a run or a hill run, do a stair climb, but take it generally easy on those days. Don't go hell for leather in the new activity. Another little tip that I found very useful for athletes that we work with is ride without power when you're coming back from an overtraining period or an overreaching period. Ride without power for a day or two, because you can get obsessed with the metrics and they can actually drag you down. If you see your numbers as low, it becomes a problem. And then, as I said, do a social ride that can help, and maybe set some new targets for yourself. Say, look, this is a new baseline. I'm going to build from scratch. Yeah, I know my FTP was 300, but I can't achieve that. I'm doing 250 today, so my new baseline is 250. On Intervals ICU, you can set a new season goal from, let's say, this week. So you set wholly new targets from this week. Start afresh, build afresh, and you'll make new gains, without being dragged down by your old concept of what you were in the past. And believe it or not, doing that approach, you'll often outstrip your past gains in the future. Like, you're not going to be stuck. You believe your body is stuck forever? That's very rare. You're likely to be in a temporary dip. So the idea is make a change, start positively, be consistent, and you will make gains again, just like you did in the past. Have confidence, have faith in yourself, guys. All right, this was my video on fatigue, fitness, freshness, training metrics, fatigue metrics, all that kind of stuff. Check out our CTL calculator, training load ramp rates. That's what we're talking about. And don't worry too much about temporary dips, guys. You will come back from them. And by sure, hit me up if you need more specific one-to-one advice. We've recently launched our online coaching model, not Beretta, but alternative to that. We've got our Facebook community. 30 people have joined FastFitnessTips paid coaching online model. It's only around $30 per month at the moment with the introductory offer until the end of the year. All right, guys, put any requests for any other topics you want to see me cover in the future in the comment section of this video, and tell me whether you've had any problems with fitness, burnout, or overreaching in the past and what you did about it. All right, happy training, guys. See you in the next video. This is Coach Alex signing off. As always, take care. Hey guys, this is going to be one of the last videos of the decade from FastFitnessTips, and I just want to give a shout out to all of the viewers here to say thank you for your kind support over the last few years. We've really appreciated it, whether you've been a downloader of our Training Peaks plans, whether you've been a follower on Facebook, Twitter, or other social media, or whether you've been a coached athlete, whatever it is, even if it's just likes, shares, and other good feedback, healthy criticism, and good banter. I really appreciate it. So thanks a lot from FastFitnessTips, and I'll see you